Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Media Watch. I'm your host, Dr. Savi, and we return again to look at the news headlines for the week. I'd like to introduce you to a guest who's been on before, and we tried our best to get him back. It's been quite a few weeks now, and we're very pleased to have back Joe Sidhu, QC. Now, he happens to be the president of the Society of Asian Lawyers, also one of the country's leading criminal barristers. Welcome, Joe. Good to see you.
Pleasure to be back, Savi.
So just to explain the show format again, we take a headline from the week, we also look at a number of headlines from around the world, and finally we look at Sikh-specific news from around the world. So let's start off with the very first thing that's on the top of the agenda, hot off the press, is the Scotland decision about yes or no in terms of staying independent or not independent, or whatever format of independence that's going to be, whether it be devolution, the multiple ways in which that's been described. Now, the decision, just by over 10%, is that Scotland have decided to not go for independence. It's a very interesting result. I think it's also interesting from the perspective that right at the last minute, I think within the last week or so, there was something called the vow, which all three major parties in the UK actually suggested to Scottish voters to say, here we go, here are some special powers that we'll put into place. Now, one criticism is that why was that put in at such a late stage, a little bit too much, too late, or too little, too late, depending on your opinion. I'd like to say, Joe, interesting. You know, something like 84.5% turnout, which is unbelievable.
A remarkable turnout, actually, Savi, and probably twice as high as you'd get in the average general election. And one has to ask the question, why is it that the Scottish people felt so motivated to be involved in one of these critical decisions in their nation's history, the most important decision perhaps for 300 years?
Okay.
Because, of course, Scotland became part of the Union in 1707. And there's been a settlement ever since. And it's only been in the recent times, since we've had devolution of powers to Holyrood by the last Labour government in the 1990s, that the Scottish have got a taste now for what it feels like to have more control over their political and economic affairs. And so this whole election, this whole referendum for the Scottish people was really a test to see whether or not they felt that true independence was the way for them to go, or whether they could be content with the settlement that they'd got from devolution. And that difference, 55% against independence, 45% in favour, is almost a split, of course, right down the middle.
Yep.
And one has to ask, well, what's the legacy of this election? You've got 16 and 17-year-olds participating as voters for the very first time in our nation's history. Is that going to set a precedent now for the general election? You've got such a high turnout, which indicates that the public are capable of engaging in political debate. It depends on what you put in front of them.
I think it's interesting that all parties have actually said, you know, on either side have said it's kind of like a most amazing campaign. I just wanted to share with the viewers the headlines. We'll put the headlines up from the leading papers. The Guardian says, Scotland history makers. The Independent says, power to the people. The Scotsman says, the nation speaks. The Sun, funny, not so funny, Union back rather than Union Jack. And the Times says, we stay together. But just returning to this issue about why people think it's such an important kind of thing to talk about, independence or not independence, or power, or kind of greater devolution. Do you think that there's a renewed interest in politics, but also do you think that communities want to have more say about what's actually happening in their neighbourhood, versus the fact there's a suspicion that a lot of the revenues, because one of the big arguments that was spoken about was, oh, is there only 25 years worth of oil left or 150 years worth of oil left? I know there's calculations that are used about how much money should be spent on per person in that country. Do people feel a suspicion that the fact that there isn't enough being spent in their country?
I think there's an element of that. I mean, there are two different impulses, a political impulse and there's an economic impulse. On the economic front, of course, we've had a recession that's lasted some years and we're not out of it yet. And the Scots no doubt feel that their own resources, particularly North Sea oil, ought to be entirely under their control, and they feel that they can fund, by way of revenue from North Sea oil, all the expenditure that they need, or at least most of it. There's a big argument about that. Of course, the argument between whether they should be independent or not was, would they be economically better off, or would they be adrift in the international economy? Would they lose the pound? Would international corporations and international financiers turn their back on Scotland? We'll never know, because, of course, the decision has gone the other way. They're going to stay within the Union.
It certainly would have been challenging,
but
wouldn't
the political impulse, Savi, is a fascinating one. It's not just confined to Scotland. Over the last 20 years in this country, we've had a movement towards devolution. It was brought in by the Blair government in the 1990s to give Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland more control over their affairs. And that was a recognition of the fact that over the years since the Second World War, there had been too much centralisation, too much control from Whitehall, too much control from Parliament in London, and that it was time to let the outer regions of the country have more say in their affairs.
So specifically, what's your response to someone like, say, Nigel Farage, who, depending on your opinion, whether he's serious or not a serious politician, that's a quick insult to the Independence Party, but they might be good, who knows? They certainly have got a lot of support at the moment. Nigel Farage says that he's going to write to all the MPs, Scottish MPs, and say, well, you shouldn't really be voting on English, inverted commas, issues, because, because you're going to have a bit more power in your area.
Well, this is the risk. Once you open Pandora's box, you give people a taste of devolution. You say to them, well, is this really what you want, and do you want to take it to its logical conclusion and become independent? You have to remember that England, being the greatest part of the Union, 80% of the population of the UK live in England.
Yep.
London is the centre, because we have the UK Parliament based there. And there will be a reaction amongst some English people who will be whipped up, no doubt, by people like Nigel Farage, who are always looking to find some sort of jingoistic handle on all of this, to say, now that the Scots have flexed their muscles, talked about wanting to be independent, maybe we as English people should also say, well, what about us? Maybe we should have more powers concentrated in our hands, and we shouldn't let Scots get involved in our decision-making, which is the decision that was being discussed about what's called the West
Does that mean there should be a First Minister for England rather than a Prime Minister for all of it?
But it's absurd. But it's absurd, Sabi, because we've got a Prime Minister.
Well, yeah, but do you need a Prime Minister for the United Kingdom and then you have a First Minister for England?
It doesn't make sense.
But does it make sense to have a First Minister for Wales?
Well, the difference is they are countries which are much smaller than England. UK Parliament is based in London. We have a Prime Minister. Do we need to have a First Minister? Look what happened when Boris Johnson became the Mayor of London. Pundits started saying this is becoming a competitive polar power base to David Cameron in number 10, because Boris Johnson's a big personality. And that made David Cameron very nervous. I think we've got to have a sense of what our institutions are trying to deliver for us as people, and whether they are efficient in doing that. And if you've got a system that works relatively well, then why would you want to fix it? It's not broke.
But are they out of touch, though? Because if they, there's all this thing about having a surgery and having time in your constituency for your the people that have voted for you or not voted for you to come and see you to talk about their problems and escalate issues or change laws and stuff. Are they spending enough time with their constituents, or are they actually just coming into Westminster and then spending 5 days a week in Westminster and the rest of it doing it on the weekend?
Most MPs work very, very hard.
I'm not knocking that.
And the reason why I say that is not because I'm paying them a compliment for the sake of it. Most MPs work very hard because presumably they enjoy what they do as public servants, but also because they want to get re-elected. So they need to cultivate their constituencies and be responsive to their constituents if they want to ensure that next time around those same constituents become voters who support them. So I think our system, broadly speaking, works rather well, particularly as far as the UK Parliament's concerned. I don't have experience of the Scottish Parliament, Northern Irish Parliament, or the Welsh Parliament. I don't have enough experience to be able to say whether they are efficient. But I think devolution has worked to this extent. It's been a public recognition that London should not control everything within the United Kingdom, that people should have the power to control their own affairs. The question is, how do you divide that power? How far do you go? Should you give them tax-raising powers? Should you give them their own defense systems? Should you allow them to control their lives in other respects, which may bring them into conflict with the centre? That's the real issue.
I think the key word that emerges before we close the subject is the issue around trust. Is there trust with the people that they've elected to represent them in their particular communities, to come back to those communities and offer them support and help, and also escalation of issues?
It's trust and it's remoteness.
Yeah.
People who sit in Glasgow and Edinburgh don't necessarily feel that London best represents their interests, although they have
well, maybe that's the reason why
who sits in Parliament in London. But still, I think there is a need to recognise that around the world, communities around the world are asking to have more control over their lives, and central governments...
Because the system's not working.
Yeah,
because
the systems are not working because centralised government may have had a function at a certain time in the post-war era in order to ensure that there was a reconstruction of economies and there was the ability to build up government bureaucracies and give people employment. But now that we're in the 21st century, I think it's a different landscape, and I think people now feel smaller is better. They want control over their own lives in the way that they
I would also say that there is an agenda, a kind of a whole timetable of things that are going to take place over the next few months. One of the big criticisms, before we kind of move on to the next subject, is whether or not there's enough time. And the problem is if you do things really quickly, you kind of can, it's a bit like if you've got a wall and you, not that I know anything about plastering, but if you've got cracks and you do a real quick job on it, you're not really doing a proper set of layers and foundations and understanding the issues.
I didn't know that we'd shared a builder.
Did the builder do a bad job for you as well, did he? Okay, well, let's move on to the next part of the program. I think the key word we were talking about before was trust. Well, GlaxoSmithKline have had a big issue. I think they're going to be fined 490 million by China for bribery, which begs the question. I think they're just going to apologize, apparently, and then they're going to get fined. So big corporations can get away with not necessarily paying their tax, not necessarily being above board in terms of not necessarily being clear about who they're selling arms to, along with collaborating with governments to do that. Like, oh, we'll chuck a whole load of bombs in that area.
The irony of that story, of course, is that it's China who's finding a big corporation for not having played by the rules.
Yeah, exactly.
And although China, of course, is a major power, and we've talked about this before, we also know that China hasn't always played by the rules itself. I mean, there have been major issues to do with...
Well, in Africa?
Well, whether or not there's been bribery, whether there's been breaches of copyright, whether contracts that big Western companies sign with Chinese companies or partners in the government in China, whether they're honored properly.
Well, we're not here to criticize China. What we're here to do is to say, if, for example, if we say China is a communist country that have got a kind of morphed sense of capitalism, which they've created in their own kind of weird way, which is true, true communism doesn't actually have an element of, kind of the capital economy that we see here, the economic model, but they seem to have pulled it off somehow. Where is the moral? We spoke about this last week with my guest, Gurpreet. Where are the morals in society that are stopping people from doing that? And I think we spoke about this just before the show. Look at bankers, They're still paying people bonuses. There's still a situation where the public have bailed out the bankers, right? And we find that they get away with it.
There's a moral issue, Savi, but there's a legal issue as well. The moral question, of course, is that GlaxoSmithKline are having to answer for what they did. The question is, of course, who did they think they were bribing? So the Chinese have to ask themselves as well, why did GSK think that they could get away with something like that? It must be because there was a receptive partner in China somewhere.
But is it part of business?
But the bigger question is this, is that we have got a real issue internationally with a lack of laws that are commonly accepted and agreed to by different major economic players in different countries. And the reason why big corporations are able to get away with misbehaving in the way that they do, breaking domestic laws of individual nations, are not in a position to bargain with them, avoid paying their taxes. We've seen when we've talked about Amazon and Starbucks paying a paltry amount in taxation to the British Exchequer. The reason why they get away with this is because we have no international regulation of any meaningful note. People are not able to enforce laws against these big corporations unless it's litigated somewhere, like in London. Business crime operated on an international scale across continents, where companies are able to get away with anything they like because governments simply aren't able to challenge them or are too afraid to challenge them because they're afraid that they will lose.
Do you think they're being
negligent?
Negligent? Are they being kind of innocent and saying, oh, I don't know whether this is right or whether this is wrong? I think we've had this conversation before. When do you get to a point when you realize that I shouldn't be investing this fund and investing that fund? And then ultimately you get to a point where you hope that the mistakes that you've made, I'm talking about traders, and then we know some specific examples of traders, or even if you watch films like The Wolf of Wall Street, the amount of kind of just pure wastage and really taking a mickey, to put it, kind of gently, in terms of the abuse of the system in order to make more money, driven on greed, right? Now, so is it up to laws to make sure that happens?
Let us remind ourselves what happened in late 2007 when the banking crisis was precipitated by the behavior of certain banks. The governments and the taxpayer bailed them out, right? So it's people, ordinary people, who bailed out the banks. The question is, who was answerable for the bankers' behavior? Was their behavior simply bad decisions made by traders who invested money when they shouldn't have?
Was that negligence?
Was that negligence or was that criminal behavior? Now, the big question, I think, the big challenge for certainly this country, because we are an important actor on the international stage. London is one of the three trading centers is New York, London, and Tokyo stock exchanges. The big question is, what are we doing to restrain the behavior of bankers so that we don't have a repetition of what we saw 4 or 5 years ago, okay? Where we were plunged into a huge crisis that was
every time you ask
paid
them,
for by the taxpayer.
but every time you ask them, you say to them, well, you know, we need to put more regulation in.
Yeah.
And they say, well, don't put regulation in because we'll move our business off to another country.
Yeah.
And that's going to, and you know, there'll be a brain drain.
Which is a form of
You know,
blackmail, which is a way of saying
is that for
countries
real?
and governments...
Could that happen?
No, because what they do with governments, and governments fall for this every single time, is they say to governments, if you remove our bonuses, if you make life difficult for us to operate within London, we'll take our money and we'll take it elsewhere, which is a bluff, because there's no evidence that they'd ever do that. But they do it time and time again, and it's used as an excuse. That, as I said, Savi, the real question here is, what do we do to restrain their behavior? If you were a doctor and you carried out an operation in an operating theatre and you messed the operation up, if you messed it up because you were negligent, you'd be dealt with on a professional basis for negligence. You wouldn't be prosecuted by the police. However, if you behaved so badly in the operating theatre that there was no question, it wasn't simply that you overlooked something, you were doing something which was so reckless that any person looking at what you were doing would say, that's criminal. That's the question we should be asking about our banking community and about some of our international corporations. Is the way that they behave here and abroad bordering on criminal? Bribery is a criminal offence. Corruption can be a criminal offence. Avoiding or evading your taxes in a way which is unacceptable is a criminal offence. Who's bringing them to book?
Well, I would say one thing, that, and I had an opportunity, and a friend of mine who asked me as part of a housing trust, and he said to me, we had Reverend Jesse Jackson came over, and I had a great opportunity to meet him. He was representing the coalition, the Rainbow Coalition based in New York, and he said, isn't it amazing, he said he was on his way to India to a conference, and he stopped over, and he said, isn't it amazing that when it came down to people not being able to afford their mortgages, the bankers were fantastic to say, there you go, here's a load of money, you can borrow some money and buy a house. But they were the first in the queue to say, we're going to repossess your house.
Yeah.
So the creativity seems to disappear when it comes to actually getting the money back, but the creativity exists in terms of lending money.
And there's a great deal of creativity invested by all sorts of corporations, banking and other corporations, into how they can avoid paying their taxes.
Absolutely.
It's amazing.
And maybe we haven't got access to those resources.
The point is, we need to have, on the government side, on the side of the people, resources and skills and people who are able to do what people do in the private sector to match them. Right. So that if there's misbehavior going on, we should be able to detect it with investigators who are equally, if not more skilled, than those who are being employed by the big corporations to commit these crimes, because often it's crimes that they are committing.
Well, maybe they're not paid enough.
The last point of this as well, the last point of this, Savi, is this. There is a sense amongst ordinary folk that there is one law for us and there's one law for them. Even with the HMRC, take as a simple example for Asian people with Asian businesses, many of whom are small traders, who often find that their books are being inspected by HMRC, who don't trust what they're returning on their tax returns.
They'll do that if there's irregularity.
And they do it sometimes as spot checks as well,
right.
But they do it with small traders who are finding it difficult to make money at the best of times. But do they do it with Starbucks? Do they do it with Amazon? Do they invest the resources to hunt down the people who are making, in fact, creating the biggest losses to the exchequer, running into millions and billions of pounds, which in fact is the biggest drain on our national resources? I think that's where there should be more focus, and governments need to be more brave about these things.
Okay, so on the note of having enough resources, now I know over in Victoria, there's just opposite the school in London, there's actually kind of an amnesty kind of box that's been put there for people to put their knives and stuff in, because I think there was a crime that took place. But I note, just again, hot off the press, we see that a grandfather has shot dead his daughter and 6 children before taking his own life at home in Bell, Florida. And I think the kids were from 3 months to 10 years old. We see this time and time again. We've seen the Oak Creek. It was literally just a year and a month since somebody went in there, and Michael Page fatally shot 6 people at the Gurdwara at Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and then he took his own life. And it was a very brave police lieutenant, I think, if I got that wrong, but a very senior police person there who actually went there to try and help, and he got injured. I think he's okay now.
Yeah.
It's time and time again, there are problems in the US. There are problems here, but in the US, obviously they've got the gun law, but it seems that everyone seems to be able to own a gun, and you hear, you know, the mass killings taking place, you know.
The massacres that they've had in the US have become legendary. And we know about the more recent one. We know about Virginia Tech. We know about the Aurora Theater shooting. We know about Columbine High School, which goes back many, many years. Americans are allowed to carry guns by virtue of the Second Amendment of the US Constitution. It goes back several hundred years. There's been a big debate about that more recently. When the last massacre took place, Barack Obama himself said, look, we need to have a serious conversation about this. Do we want to go on like this?
But the National Rifle Association resisted.
Yeah, the NRA, which is a hugely funded organization, was able to resist it, and there's a huge backlash every time anyone talks in the United States about restricting possession of firearms. Think of it this way, Savi. We have in the US a population of something like 306 million people. There are 310 million firearms. There's one firearm for every man, woman, child, and baby in the United States of America. And those 310 million firearms are about a third handguns, a third rifles, and a third of them are shotguns. It's an extraordinary amount of weaponry that's circulating within society.
But is there an increase in the UK? The same kind of thing?
In the UK, of course, we have a ban on handguns. We've had a ban on handguns ever since the Dunblane massacre, when a man went into a school and shot many children. The year after, the law was changed to stop anyone other than a police officer who's licensed to carry a handgun having a handgun. People can still use shotguns, and they can use shotguns for recreational use, but they're very restricted if you want to keep one in your house. So our gun laws are much, much more restrictive than the US gun laws, and accordingly, we don't have anything like as much gun crime. There is gun crime. My own experience as a criminal barrister, having done cases involving contract killings and shootings where people have been got rid of on the orders of someone else, is that we have a problem with gun crime, but about only 10% of our homicides are gun-related. In the US, 2/3 of homicides are caused by a gun. You can see the disparity, and that's because we don't have guns as widely in circulation. But we've got a problem. Young people involved in gangs in London, Manchester, Birmingham, Nottingham, and other parts of the country, there have been a number of shootings which have got into the news because teenagers are now able to access firearms. And often they're carrying firearms because they use it as a way of controlling their patch. This is often drug-related.
Are there sometimes like contract killers as well?
Sometimes they're given firearms by more experienced older men who are running drugs empires who want to get rid of their opponents.
So cause and effect-wise, right, it would be US or UK, right, it's drugs, right?
Drugs are a big part of the explosion in weaponry in this country.
So does that mean that our governments are not doing enough?
But not necessarily in the US.
But governments are not doing enough to stop this. They're not doing enough at the actual places where this stuff is imported or smuggled in.
Are you talking about guns or drugs?
I'm talking about both.
Okay,
I'm talking about the fact that, first of all, if you look, the root cause is drugs. Right? So is it because there's established kind of gateways that we don't even know about?
So there's no necessary connect. Drugs dealing has been going on in this country for hundreds of years, okay? Let's be clear about that. It's become more organized in the last 30 or 40 years because you have gangs now operating and controlling patches, much like the mafia used to do in the US. But guns were never necessarily part of that. Enforcers used to use knives and other weapons in order to keep their business under their control. Guns have become an added weapon in the armory in order to enforce your will as a drugs baron. But the two things aren't necessarily connected together. In the US, it's very different because, of course, guns have been around since the US existed. It's part of the Constitution for you to be able to have one. But, of course, guns are also used to enforce drugs. These are complex problems. The real question that I want to ask is, if we have now teenagers running around the streets of London, carrying firearms and using firearms on other teenagers, killing other children, effectively, because they are being hired to do so by senior members of drugs gangs, and I know this from the cases that I've done myself, we need to start asking some really deep questions about what is going on with these kids. Because it's one thing them carrying knives, which are lethal enough, but once you put a gun into a 17-year-old's hand, you are asking for.
But I would say that, you know, like it goes back down to, you know, is it an easy kind of thing to say it's the kids, it's the kids, it's the gangs? Is it the fact there isn't enough policing, or not enough intelligence, not enough Interpol, not enough priority and it's just kind of brushed under the I mean, you don't hear about it in the news. It's just brushed underneath
the police are
the
trying
rug.
to contain a problem which they cannot contain.
Right.
Because the number of, if you speak, as I've done, to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Bernard Hogan-Howe, he will tell you that the police, one of the biggest challenges the police have in London is the spread of gangs all the way through.
Yeah, but people are dying, right?
They're
and they're dying
dying
not only by taking drugs, they're dying because there's not enough policing, inverted commas, to stop the stuff from
Not
coming
in
into
the
the
numbers
UK.
that you think, though, Sonny.
Yeah.
I mean, keep this in perspective. In the US, I've said to you already, 2/3 of homicides are gun-related. In this country, 10%. And even the 10% which are gun-related, not all of them, or even the majority of those, are to do with drugs.
Okay.
Drugs are a problem in and of itself, but
Okay.
drugs come into the equation.
So
which
what is
makes
it? So it's
makes
drugs
it more
and what
toxic.
else? Family problems?
Well, if you're thinking about firearms or you're thinking about drugs, there's a complexity problem. Kids who are getting, let's look at the Asian community, okay? In the Asian community, the number one drug is what? It's alcohol,
Yeah, okay.
which there's widespread abuse of.
Yeah, there is, yeah.
You now have, of course, a generation of youngsters who are getting involved in hard drugs. A lot of the people who've come over as Fojis, who are sleeping on the streets of West London,
I've seen it myself
are
in
involved in
Southall.
Class A drugs
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah,
So
I've seen it.
heroin, cocaine, and the addiction is now becoming more and more widespread. There is a serious question that the Asian community needs to ask itself. How have we ended up with not only having widespread alcohol abuse, which was a big enough problem of its own, causing huge numbers of social problems and family problems, how have we ended up now having such a huge drugs problem that our youngsters are being caught up in this, sometimes intelligent, educated youngsters who fall into the trap of thinking that drugs is a way to enjoy themselves, and before they know it, they're addicted.
But whose role is it in society to better educate? Is it the teachers? Is it the government to produce more papers? Is it the social services to get involved? Where do we see
It's
the early
everyone's-
warning signs of
it's
this happening in
everyone's
society?
responsibility. We are not private, individuals living in a cocoon. We live as part of communities. It starts with the family and how you teach your children what are
But
important
there could be
values,
lovely
what their
families.
priorities
But there
should
could be lovely families,
Not-
and they could be mixed
it's
up with
true.
bad company,
But if
and
you
the
look-
bad company influences
But
them.
if you look at the, as I know from my own experience of having represented many people who got in the criminal justice system who are on drugs, who are addicted to drugs and get involved in all sorts of crime, when you look at their families, often the families are broken families. They're single-parent families. They're families which have no internal cohesion. They're families where there's no record of educational achievement. By the same token, if you take families where there's been high-achieving youngsters through school and university, very rarely do you find that those same youngsters end up addicted to drugs. It's because of kids who don't have those opportunities or don't take up those opportunities in education and in work, who fall by the wayside and they become vulnerable to drug addiction. So it's responsibility of families, responsibility of schools, responsibility of religious leaders and communities.
Yeah.
It's also the responsibility of the government to create an economic environment in which there are opportunities for young people to take up so that they can go and get jobs that give them some meaning in life, earn an income, stay away from drugs, earn money, buy a house, have a family. That is what makes solid, stable communities. So all of us share a responsibility in making
And
that
I think it's really interesting. I was watching this program on BBC last night, a really amazing program about a Filipino couple. Sadly, the husband had an accident while going over to the Philippines to actually show his newly born kids, and he suffered a major accident. And what was really amazing was, I think the program's called SOS DIY, SOS, something like that.
Yeah.
And the whole community has got together, all volunteers or builders have got together. They redid the house so that it would be much more accessible for the couple as well as their kids. And it was a lovely feeling of community. And he said this, Nick Knowles, who presents the program at the institute, isn't it great to see what communities can do if they work together?
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of a lesson, I think, for society as it is today. That rather than being insular, it's easy to say, shut the door, it's freezing cold outside, or enjoy your own life, but we don't get involved in community enough.
Yeah.
But maybe there needs to be that
Do
facilitation.
you feel the same way as I do, Sabi? I having grown up in Southall all my life and seen how that community pulled together at critical times
Yes,
in its
I remember
history,
that.
particularly when it was threatened from the outside by the National Front in 1979, 1981.
Absolutely.
That we had a very strong sense of community cohesion. But do you not feel now that it's becoming more and more fragile? People are becoming more self-interested.
Yep.
And there's now a fracture going on where those whose children have done well at school and university, those kids move out of Southall and they go on with their lives, and the ones who are left behind stay in Southall. And there's now almost like a class divide within our community, which was never there before. Because back in the 60s and 70s, whether you had money or you didn't have money, people all went to the same gurdwaras, temples, mosques, and they prayed together. They felt they were part of the same setup.
Absolutely.
And now I have a sense that it's changing. And it's changing in a way which means that if there was a reason for people to want to come together, some would, and some would say...
I would say there was an element of community,
busy.
but maybe the element of community is getting more disparate. Let's move on to the final part of the programme. We've only got just a few minutes left to actually cover this area. I mentioned before about the Oak Creek sad, unfortunate anniversary, just literally a month and a year or so ago, about the killing that took place. We also know that Balbir Singh Sodhi was shot within just days of the 9/11 2001 tragedy with the Twin Towers. It was a case of premeditated murder. It was proven in court about that a guy waited for him and shot him at the petrol station. He was apparently a really nice, lovely guy. His niece is called Rose Kaur, and I strongly encourage you to go online. There's a really good website called Sikh24.com, and over there she's written a really amazing poem, very emotional poem. We talk about community, we talk about, everyone coming together. I'm just going to, I'll try and see if I can get to the end of this. Just read this out to you. The poem's actually called My Father Lives, and here it is. She says, my father lives in New York's buildings which scrape the skies, and my father lives in Afghanistan mountains which kiss the moon, and my father lives in Mesa, Arizona, desert plain, which swallows the first sand's storm bullet. Yes, my father, Balbir Singh Sodhi. Yes, my father offers himself to strangers' babies. He clinks and clangs with each coin tossed. Into every collection plate of prayers to heal a sister, a brother, another's wounds. And my father wraps his love for every self, every family, every faith, in each turban, cloth, pleat, laid soft onto forehead, across nap, set back to forehead, with patterned care, like 1,000 rows of careful lined sugarcane field. And my father plants every continent's flag, every nation's flag, every people's flag. On his accent tongue he waves the banner of humanity breaking borders with every stumble of speech, contradiction of grammar, hesitation of language. And my father stretches, lifts, rises from the fibre of every muscle of every man who pumps gas or drives a taxi just so wheat and rice can melt in his child's stomach. And my father lives in New York, Afghanistan, Mesa, Arizona, in the guilty, innocent, terrorist, civilian, in the leader, follower, persecutor, persecuted, in the thunder, lightning, war, peace, and in my heartbeat, your heartbeat, our heartbeat, and my father lives in my love, your love, our love. Yes, my father Balbir Singh Sodhi. Yes, my father lives.
Very beautiful tribute.
Amazing.
To a man who died a very tragic death because of people misunderstanding our religion and misunderstanding that, somebody who wears a turban is not a terrorist, he's a Sikh. And that was the tragedy of Balbir, that he died in those circumstances. But what a wonderful tribute from his daughter,
Amazing.
Recognizing
From his niece, yeah.
her father, his niece's contribution that he had made to the world before he passed on.
So I strongly encourage you to go to the website Sikh24.com and just have a look at it and read it in your own time. The name of the girl, talent, individual is Rose Kaur. So we've come to the end of the show. Thank you so much, Joe, for joining us again. It's so great to have you on. Very knowledgeable, very intelligent. Until next time, we look forward to seeing you again. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.